Hi there. In this short video, we'll summarise some of the key gains from globalisation. And we'll look at some of the disadvantages from globalisation in a separate topic video. Of course, there are many different definitions of globalisation. I quite like this short, succinct one. Globalisation is a process in which national economies, national countries have become increasingly integrated and interdependent. Those two key words, integration, interdependence, are very much in tune with globalisation. Here's a definition from the OECD, the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development. They define globalisation as the geographic dispersion of industrial and service activities, for example, R&D, research and development, sourcing of inputs, production and distribution, and the cross-border networking of companies, for example, through joint ventures and the sharing of assets. Hey, what about that for a definition? You know what? I prefer this one again. It's a process, it's not inevitable, which national countries become more integrated and interdependent. That's my preferred definition. Now, there are many different aspects of globalisation. In many countries, not all, trade to GDP ratios are rising. In other words, the value of exports and imports as a share of GDP is going up. There's more capital flowing across national borders. In other words, financial capital flows. There's increased FDI, particularly emerging countries. And one of the key features has been the rise in FDI between developing and emerging countries. There are many more global brands now, including, again, a rising number of brands from emerging nations. There's a much deeper specialisation of labour, the emergence of vertical supply chains. So, for example, the iPhone and the iPad, the components come from many different countries. Of course, we've seen an increase in the level of labour migration, both within nations and between countries. And more generally, people associate globalisation with greater, quicker, more detailed connectivity between people and businesses, for example, through mobile networks and Wi-Fi. Now, what are some of the key gains from globalisation? What I've tried to do is put together one or two of the kind of main arguments to capture some of the arguments here. Well, first of all, globalisation is a process which encourages producers and consumers to reap the benefits from a deeper division of labour and economies of scale. In other words, globalisation encourages specialisation and trade based, for example, on comparative advantage theory. Globalisation can often increase the competition or the contestability of markets, which in theory brings down the level of monopoly supernormal profit, and that threat of competition, both actual and the threat, can incentivise businesses to seek out cost-reducing innovations and reduce the amount of inefficiency in markets. Globalisation, in many cases, not every country, but in many, has brought down extreme poverty. It's done that because it's boosted growth, and that's led to higher per capita incomes. As we'll see in a minute, there's been a substantial fall in absolute poverty in the world economy as a whole. A fourth advantage is the potential gains from the free movement of labour between countries. Now, I know that labour migration is a controversial as well as a very topical issue, but in many ways, the free movement of skilled and unskilled workers across countries is a form of trade, and there are benefits to be had from that. We'll look at labour migration in a separate topic video. Globalisation also promotes dynamic efficiency gains over time. That flows from the greater sharing, the diffusion of ideas and skills and technologies across national borders. And globalisation has also involved the increased flow of capital as capital markets, for example bonds and equities, have become more open, allowing, for example, developing countries to borrow money to help overcome a domestic savings gap. I think more generally, one thinks about the cultural and political aspects of globalisation. They're important too, even in an economic discussion. So people are just more aware of global issues, they're more aware of climate change issues, they're certainly particularly in tune with the debates over income and wealth inequality. People are travelling more people living and working overseas, and there's a greater global awareness of some of the systemic risks as well as the systemic opportunities that face the world. And finally, the competitive pressures of globalisation may actually, over time, prompt better government and better labour protection, for example, through improved business standards. Now, that's not an easy one to justify given the criticisms of globalisation in terms of labour exploitation. But often, for example, the movement of people across borders, the transfer of migrants across borders, is a catalyst for political reform. So overall, I think globalisation is a way of enhancing the gains from trade and exchange. It increases the size of markets, it generates scale economies, and it promotes, hopefully, faster, more durable economic growth. And just to finish with, here's a quick bit of data from the World Bank, a figure that came out in April 2016. According to the most recent estimates, just 3 or 4 years ago, 12.7% of the world's total population, that's more than 7 billion people, 12.7% lived at or below the $1.90 a day level for extreme poverty. $1.90 PPP adjusted. Now that is still very high, okay, it's over 800 million people, but it's down from 37% in 1990 and 44% in 1981. Globalization has been a process which has contributed in some shape or form to one of the biggest falls in absolute and extreme poverty the world has ever seen. So these are some of the gains from globalization.